So, huge news today from the Middle East. Bashar al-Assad has finally fallen. This is a major development, and there was sort of some signs this may have been happening in the last few days, but it's official now. His regime is done. Um, there were mixed reports that his plane had actually went down, but apparently he has now arrived in Moscow, so no big surprise there. He's went into exile in Moscow. It's highly, highly unlikely that he will ever return to Syria, and that is entirely of his own making. I'm not going to make this video very, very extensive because I haven't bought any of the papers on this yet, and there's going to be a lot of things to talk about. So for now, I'm just going to give my honest opinions. I largely welcome it, but there is a tint of caution as well, and I'll come to that. But firstly, we need to look at the facts. Bashar al-Assad was a brutal, brutal dictator, no question about it. Even if you want to believe Russian propaganda, even if you want to believe that Assad was simply a beleaguered leader fighting I mean, it's almost a cruel joke to say that because Syrians around the world are celebrating the demise of this man. Um, so you may believe that the chemical attacks are just made up by the West or even somehow carried out by pro-Western forces or something like that. I think the White Helmets group has done incredible work out there. They've been maligned by Russian state propaganda, but I had a Syrian colleague at university, and obviously he felt strongly about these issues. And I remember it would have been around sometime after Arab Spring. It would have been around 2012 or thereabouts. And there was a documentary film showing about the various countries impacted by Arab Spring. And I distinctly recall when Assad appeared, there was this chorus of jeers and boos from the students, many of them from Syria and from other countries as well. But that was a good indicator of feelings about this man. And my colleague was no Islamist, he was no ISIS sympathizer, he was just an ordinary Syrian. Who, like many ordinary Syrians, are wholly fed up with this regime. No one should make any mistake about the regime of Bashar al-Assad. This is a man who used chemical weapons on children, who dropped barrel bombs on children. Even by Middle Eastern standards, Assad was particularly brutal. I'd put him up there with Saddam Hussein in terms of sheer depravity. Um, Definitely one of the worst. His demise in of itself is definitely a good thing. And Syrians should be allowed to enjoy this moment. Syrians who are celebrating should be allowed to, take it. There's been interviews by the BBC, people saying they can finally breathe on the streets of Damascus, that the tyrant is now gone. Um, and Assad should count himself lucky that he at least can be alive, in exile. He's had a different fate from Saddam and Gaddafi. But sooner or later, all dictatorships collapse. Not all by the same reasons, but they all collapse sooner or later. And so I definitely welcome this in of itself. Now, we do have to throw in a little bit of caution because the history of the Middle East shows that often you get optimistic developments and then it turns into something darker or something that just prolongs suffering. Indeed, Arab Spring turned into Arab Winter. Syria, unlike some of the other countries involved in that, didn't see their dictator fall immediately. Instead, it saw a very, very costly war. I do think Assad bears huge responsibility for the start of that war. I won't say it was all his responsibility, but his response to legitimate protests, this must never be forgotten, was brute force. If you listen to Russian propaganda and if you listen to other anti-West sources on this, the narrative is Assad was simply a beleaguered president fighting to save his country from uh, Islamist fanatics. But ISIS and co, what they done was they took advantage of a vacuum, or not a vacuum, they took advantage of the quagmire that was being created in that country. Remember, ISIS only became a significant force around 2014, right? The Syrian war began in late 2010. Now, the significance of that is I remember that UN vote in 2013, after the Ghouta chemical attack. The Economist was one of many British publications um, really advocating for hard strikes against Assad. But anyway, um, Russia and China vetoed any action against Assad. They wouldn't even criticize Assad. China more hands off than Russia, but as we know, then in 2015, Russia came in and supported the regime, which unquestionably prolonged the suffering of the Syrian people, unquestionably caused many, many more civilian deaths. I mean, the amount of blood on Vladimir Putin's hands is just, it's ocean of blood. Um, so anyone who is looking at this from the prism of trying to defend Assad and his vile regime should be ashamed of themselves. Syrian people should be allowed to enjoy this moment, and I would say this is a positive step. Um, in terms of the West, there was a Telegraph piece saying that the Syria shows the UK has lost its clout. But one of the main criticisms of the West in recent years has been too much intervention. We intervened in Libya. Libya, of course, turned into a very messy civil war. I still believe that when you have a dictator massacring their own people, doing nothing cannot be an option. But no two situations are exactly alike. Now, when David Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy arrived in Benghazi, they were cheered as liberators. Iraq, of course, Tony Blair is seen as a war criminal, and so is George W. Bush. And I was one who opposed the Iraq war. But I think Cameron's administration was absolutely correct to take military action against Assad and ISIS. Because again, if you listen to Russian propaganda, the West backs ISIS. That's complete nonsense. Because the West took military action against ISIS. I remember the film Vice. One of the reasons I did not like that film about Dick Cheney was its over the simplification of the situation in the Middle East. Adam McKay's film ended with this sort of epilogue that due to Western policy, ISIS filled the vacuum in Syria. That is a massive oversimplification. I would argue Assad's use of brute force probably radicalized some Syrians, and brought them over to ISIS. Then there were many, many other Syrians who were torn between a brutal dictator on one hand and a brutal Islamist terror group on the other. Now, today, I've put this on my timeline and I said it to my Syrian colleague. It's extremely important that the Syrian people, firstly, they're going to make their own decision about the future. This is not something Russia's being humiliated. The West isn't going to be involved in a major way. This is up to the Syrian people. What they need to do, in my opinion, if they want a better future, and it is up to them, but if they want a better future, if they don't want to be another Afghanistan, they need to have pluralism, they need to have reconciliation, they need to ensure that minorities are respected, that women are respected, that religious minorities are respected. I think it would be a push to expect Syria to become a Western liberal type democracy overnight. That is not going to happen. But if it could at least have a better future, if it could at least begin reconciliation, if it could at least begin the rebuild from the rubble. This is a war that's sort of been frozen since about 2020, and other wars start getting more attention. Tigray initially, and then of course Ukraine um, and Gaza. But I should say the Near East. But as we've seen this advance, I think probably, the rebels is a very, very loose term because it's not one single group. I do have a little bit of concern that there will be Islamist factions in there and they will want a seat at the table. So it's going to be a real, real balancing act. Like I say, I haven't read all the coverage of this. No doubt there'll be more videos to make. But I just hope that the Syrian people reject extremism. I hope that they don't replace a dictatorship with an Islamist theocracy resembling Iran. Iran has also been embarrassed, I should say, by these developments. So the Syrian people need to really, really think. We've been through hell for decades. We've been through tyranny. We've been through a war that's cost up to 600,000 lives, maybe more. Um, this country needs a better future. So to do that, I really, really think there has to be there has to be a situation where all voices are heard, even Islamists, but they shouldn't be able to get into power in a significant way because if they do, inevitably women's rights will be rolled back, minority rights will be rolled back, and Syria could just become a bastion for anti-West terror groups. Um, so it's good news that Assad is gone, but from an outside perspective, I'm pleased for the Syrian people, but I'm also a little bit cautious that we've seen this before where good news is then followed by bad news. So it really, really is up to the Syrian people to create a better future for the country. It's in their hands. If this goes south, no one can say it's the fault of the West or it's the fault even of other parties. This is down to the Syrian people at this point. Um, it's possible that Iran and Russia may try some sort of pro-regime insurgency. I'm not sure how much traction that will get though, because from the reports, a lot of pro-regime soldiers were defecting. They were crossing over. They also were fed up with Assad. So there seems to be a genuine consensus against Assad here. You know, the celebrations on the street, I haven't seen anyone crying over the demise of Assad. I haven't seen any Syrian crying over his demise. There probably will be some, but it's very, very important though that the rebels now create peace in the country. That these collective groups that they don't, for example, seek revenge against Assad loyalists. If people have committed war crimes, they could be held criminally responsible. But for example, if there was, say, killings of pro-regime sympathizers or something, that will only create a situation where the turmoil never ends. So there absolutely has to be reconciliation in that country. Um, God knows Syria has been through hell in the last decade and a half. So it's definitely welcome news. I think this is a good day. The Middle East doesn't often have good news. I would say this is a good day, but time will tell if there is a better future or if that country is just replacing a dictatorship with a theocracy. That's for the Syrian people, but I just hope they make the right decision. Um, from what I know of Syrian people, they are very resilient. They're intelligent. I hope will reject they will reject a Taliban style takeover. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen, but as far as I'm concerned, any theocracy is imposed in a hardline way is too much. Anyway, leave it there. But huge developments from Syria today. Um, Assad, I don't know what he's going to do for Moscow. Probably he can't do a lot. Like a lot of dictators in history, he'll probably die out his days in some Moscow apartment. And he deserves a lot worse, quite frankly. I mean, he should be in jail for life for the crimes that he's committed. But um, at least he's no longer in power, so that's something.